All right, thanks very much. As it happens now, we have time for an extra question. So I'm going to ask one that was on the minds of many of our emailers, our viewers and readers who emailed their suggestions to us, and I'm going to put it under the umbrella of health care, but you could really put it in any of these categories. There's been a lot of talk about partisan politics and gridlock in Washington lately. If elected, what would you do to overcome those things and work with Democrats and independents to move forward on the economy and health care and other issues? And on this extra round question, we're going to go to Mr. Simmons first.
I often say that my mother's a Democrat, my wife is unaffiliated, and my two children, Rob and Jane, are Republicans. But I love them all. I love them all. And I think that what I'm trying to express by that is that when it comes to many issues that concern us in America today, the economy, jobs, housing, roads, bridges, national defense, there may be a Republican solution, there may be a Democrat solution, but the solution that I look for is the American solution. The American solution. In my service in the Connecticut General Assembly for 10 years, I worked with many Democrats. In my service in Congress, I worked with many Democrats on issues where we did not have to sacrifice our principles, but we could work together effectively for a common cause. I think that can be done. I've done it. I think we need to do it some more.
All right, Mr. Schiff, to you now.
You know, a lot of people say that we need bipartisanship so we can overcome the gridlock. Well, I don't want to overcome gridlock if that's the only thing standing between us and more government. You know, I want to change what's happening in Washington, and I don't want to go to Washington to compromise my positions or my principles. I want to try to persuade and educate the other members of Congress to adopt my principles, and those are the principles of smaller government, cutting spending, cutting taxes, repealing regulations, and I'm not going to compromise. If someone says, well, just raise taxes a little bit, no, we can't afford higher taxes. The country is broke, and the people can't send more money to Washington. We have to stop Washington from taking our money, and you can't do that if you're going to compromise. We've been compromising for years, and look at the mess that we're in.
All right, Ms. McMahon.
Well, I often think the gridlock that we are seeing in Washington now is caused, by career politicians who are so concerned about being reelected. If I'm your senator serving, I'm not going to worry about being reelected. I'm going there to do a job. You're hiring me for 6 years. I'm going to do the best job I can for the people of Connecticut while I'm there. I think you have to try and drive consensus. I've done that in boardrooms. I've done it sitting across negotiating tables. But when you can't drive consensus, you have to drive your point, and you have to hold to it. I've been successful in winning a lot of those arguments. And the very best deal I ever struck was the one that both sides walked away from the table getting part of what they wanted, not all of it, but part of what they wanted, because those deals stuck. And if it was not a deal that had something in it for both sides without compromise of principles, then those were the deals that lasted. But if not, they fell apart. And you'd be back challenging them to see if you could redo the deal.
All right, and we're going to stay with our format here. You each have 1 more minute.
As I suggested in my previous comment, one can achieve consensus without sacrificing core values. And I think there are some practical examples of where we can show that. I have a core value that it is important to support the men and women who serve us in uniform. I feel very strongly about that because I myself have served in uniform for over 35 years, and I've served in a war zone and in the CIA under difficult and dangerous circumstances. But when our soldiers in Iraq did not have the proper body armor and did not have proper armor on their Humvees, what we call up-armor Humvees, I joined with Democrats of a similar opinion to work to provide those soldiers with the equipment that they needed to be safe. I didn't sacrifice my principles. The Democrats didn't sacrifice their principles. We worked together for a common objective. I think that can be done, and I think that is probably done more often than many people would like to admit.
All right. And Mr. Schiff.
Well, I think, part of this problem is you have career politicians that seem to be playing a game of one-upmanship. I mean, it seems like a lot of the the stimulus bills and the jobs bills that are being proposed by the Democrats would have been supported by the Republicans had they been proposed by George Bush. I think all of these plans are misguided. I think politicians are making their votes based on polls. I think that is the problem. I think politicians are there to get elected. They say whatever they need to say to get elected, but then they do the exact opposite to stay in office. And I think we really need to change. If you want to end gridlock in a positive way, if you want to have real free market reforms, all we're doing now is repeating all the failed mistakes of the past. People say, should we have a second stimulus? It's not a second stimulus. It's a third stimulus. The first one was under George Bush. It's the same failed policy of going deep into debt to spend money. We have to change that. We have to change Washington. And the best way to do that is to send new people to Washington.
All right. Ms. McMahon.
Well, I think probably if all else failed in Washington, I would set a ring up in the Senate chamber and lay the smackdown on some of these guys that didn't want to come to the table. I have a decided advantage. You absolutely cannot give up your principles. You have to drive a bargain hard. And it is up to us as representatives, as senators or congressmen, to represent the people who sent us to Washington. What do they want? What do the citizens of Connecticut want? What are you folks telling us? Because I'm going to be listening to you to know what you want. And if you go to Washington and you've got everything in your heart and mind that's diametrically opposed to what the people in your state want, then you've got to make some compromise along the way. And I do believe that we do have to have smaller government. There's no question about we need smaller government, but I do think that term limits is the way to go, and I would not serve more than 2 terms in the United States Senate.
All right, thank you. Candidates, we have now come to the